tax collector and very rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not, on account of the crowd, because he was small of stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see Jesus, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, He is gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost.
Glory to Jesus Christ. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I think it was back in the 1980s when there was a show on called Happy Days. If you remember or have ever seen Happy Days on TV, raise your hand. Oh, good. So about 90%, 95% of us will know what I'm touching on a little bit this morning. Because it was a rather long-running show with a remarkable child actor in it, who was then in his kind of beginning of his prime, Ron Howard. Remarkable in that, he was a child actor who actually ended up singing throughout his life, which is a very rare sort of occasion. But at one point in the show, as things will tend to deteriorate over time, something happened where it actually became the name of what happens to particularly sitcoms after they've run their race. And the phrase was, they jumped the shark. Because at one point, if you recall, Fonzie was going to jump a shark on his motorcycle. And it was kind of a marking point for when it was noticed that there was no coming back. After Fonzie jumped the shark, the show was kind of in a state of decline that was not going to be reversed. And that phrase comes to mind for me, not in the humorous sort of way that it was used back then, but in the way that I look and see what's going on in our world. Because somewhere in the last, 30, 40, 50, maybe 5,000, maybe however many millions of years or thousands of years we've been here, depending on what you would attest to as the truth about these things, somewhere along the line we jumped the shark. And while we might look at something like the election of Donald Trump as a shark jumping moment, while we might look at something like Twitter, when did it go from being something kind of useful, fun, to something as horrendous as it is? I read a thing this morning, about a college administrator. She was in charge of the graduate program. And she strongly recommended to a couple of her students, doctoral students, I think they were physicians, and that they don't speak Chinese with each other, that they use English to make their English better. Well, as is not difficult for us to gather anymore, what do you think happened to her? She got canned. She got fired. Because nowadays, you can't say anything without it ending up somehow out in some Twitter storm where anonymous people get to kind of form opinion all around the world. How crazy is that? That people who have time, and again, not to disparage anyone who might spend a little time doing that, but people who have time to just sit there and send out their opinion, very often, very vilely speaking, are somehow the people who form what we think about things and how we behave to things. So if there's a Twitter storm, all of a sudden people lose jobs. People have to resign. How insane is that? And so we have jumped the shark as a culture. Some of that can be rather humorous. I mean, it's good that in this morning's gospel lesson, the writer of the gospel was wise enough to say that he was small of stature. That's pretty politically correct. He didn't call him short, because that, no doubt, today there would be someone who could take great offense at the way Zacchaeus is described. You got to be careful, because this man who is who is small of stature, we can't describe anything without thinking someone is going to be offended and is going to exact a price. Well, we were speaking last night when we were here after Vespers about some of these kinds of things. And while it may seem, and it began rather humorously, it was a joke in the beginning. People laughed about it, but now nobody can make jokes. If you've been following the news, comedians can't make jokes anymore. There's nobody left that you can say anything with a sense of humor about without getting in trouble and perhaps losing a career, which I guess if you're a comedian and you can't make jokes, you can't make fun of things. If you can't do that, how do you even be a comedian? You can't even do that. So we've come to a place where, not for the best of reasons, but for the worst of reasons, in a 1984 kind of sense, where every look, because that young man from Covington Catholic High School, they got his picture, and the look on his face was able to be used as a way of describing his whole personality and his attitude and what was going on in his head. It was quite a remarkable thing that was set out there before us. And in this very week, we also have had a state legislature, the state legislature of New York, go so far as to now make abortion a legislative, a constitutional right in the state of New York. And not limited abortion, but abortion right to the very end and delivery. And should an abortion go wrong and a baby survive, there is no legal reason that that baby be given any sort of medical aid. So, somewhere along the line, we've jumped not only a shark, but, I don't know, a killer whale. I'm not sure what it would be. But there's always good news in these things. Because another word of the day is process crime. To where you might not have done anything wrong, but if you're asked enough questions in enough different ways, you're going to answer differently enough that you will have lied. And when we look at that word process, what we find is that as Orthodox Christians, way back in the day when what we had concerns about was somebody saying, "Are you saved?" Man, that conversation is kind of a dead one, isn't it? It used to be very much at the center of being an Orthodox Christian and getting into whatever level of light theological conversation. That conversation about "Are you saved?" would come up because the regular response from us was, I am and I'm being saved. The recognition of process. And right now we are getting one of those great examples as we approach and have been hearing the Kontakion for the feast of the presentation in the temple, because as you can read in your bulletin this morning in a couple of very beautiful reflections from Father Alexander Schmemann and Father Tom Hopko, his son-in-law, all of our lives truly are process. We are all in the midst of either process sinning or process saving. By our thoughts, acts, deeds, everything that we do is Because only in God is there no process. Only in God would we say there is perfect being, just isness. And for all the rest of us, we are on a journey. And in the feast of the presentation in the temple of Christ, we see the end of a journey of an old man, a priest in the church, who, when he received Christ into his arms, says that most beautiful prayer that we pray all the time at every Vesper service: Lord, let us now, thy servant, depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. What a beautiful, beautiful way to be able to contextualize the journey, the process of moving from our birth to moving to our departure from this life, to the end of this mortal travail. But unfortunately, we tend more toward thinking that somehow we are rather static, and that somehow we might be able to hold that line. And that is where the good news of the madness and mayhem that we see all around us comes in. Because it takes a lot to shake us loose from the things that make us feel comfortable, from the things that make us feel safe, the things that give us some sense, however false it may be, of security. And we are living in a world that is delivering that to us increasingly. Which means that we, as other generations before us, as other humans who have gone through more difficult times than they might have wanted to go through, we have an opportunity to grow. We have an opportunity to see that what has been given to us, and I can speak, again, all of us can, about the process that's gone on in our own lives. You know, there really was a time when how I understood things was rather relativistically. Not in the worst sense, but in a good sense, because there was enough in common in our way of living in this country that we were able to maybe smile and think that things were going to be okay. But as is the human tendency, we don't do well when things are going okay. No, we find ways to mess things up, and in the process discover that, yes, there are the ups and the downs. And what usually happens is that when things are going well, we pay very little attention to what's going on inside of us. We pay very little attention to things of the soul and the life of the world to come. And then when things start to go in a little bit of what we might call negative direction, in a way that we wonder, why, God? Why are you doing this? We actually do get the answer. Because what we discover, if we are not too entrenched, if we are not clinging too strongly to all those things that are vanishing as we even try and cling to them, if we do that, we will begin to discover that what we have been given in God and His church is simply the most amazing, remarkable, miraculous way of seeing and understanding all that we are. And we know that there is no one way that human beings see things. As I say all the time and notice all the time, you know, each of us in this country, all of the, 350 million of us, are free to make up our own version. And it's going to get more remarkable as time goes of what's real and what's not real. And so, in that way, for a while there, it seemed as though we had a little bit of a common understanding, which now has been shown to be totally untrue. But there is one place that we have been pointed as people who have been blessed to grow up in a fashion, in a process that has had us sitting here today. Because from the moment that you were born, and even in the generations that you preceded you, already was in motion of all the circumstances, all the events that would have us here today. And that will continue, we believe, into eternity, actually, because we as finite beings, as beings that are created out of nothing and brought here to experience infinitely glory to glory, this is how it begins for us. And so we have that option. We have the choice. When we see the madness of the world, when we see the illogic, when we see things falling apart and making no sense, we have a place to go, and that is to the simple place that we're standing in right now, which is God and His church in the body of Christ. And when we look there, we find that in the confusion of the world, there really is peace and simplicity and unity in what we find here. Because we speak of things like one God, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible. And if we're able to even decide to begin to contemplate that, and as St. Simeon did in this feast that we're approaching, and to go to that, go to God all the time, then we will be like magnets drawn there. That our desire, even as small as it may be, if it's there, will drag us through many kinds of things. And we know, again, if we've got any number of decades under our belts, that, yeah, life is pretty messy sometimes. But let us not ever lose hope that what's going on has a purpose to it, a meaning to it, and all we need to do is kind of hang on for the ride. Because God's will is that all of us know Him, that we have life and that we have it abundantly, and that is never not true. And so, when we see the world as it is, part of our big struggle, as we were talking about last night, is to recognize, for one, man, in our day and age, everything has been made political. So you can hardly have a conversation about morality or ethics without people drawing political lines and getting into arguments and fighting and virtually hating each other. Not really in a disagreement about what supposedly is about, like morality and ethics, of the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, but because, no, we've drawn the lines, and all we want to do is win. And we will go for the win at any cost. You know, again, the saddest thing that I've heard in a while was after the legislature in New York, passed the constitutional amendment for such horrendous violence toward ourselves, toward our children. They stood up and cheered. They stood up and cheered. Brothers and sisters, we have much to repent of. We have now some really good motivation to get to work. To say, you know what? Maybe even for me, it is time to change. Maybe even for me, it is time for me to look at what is really real, to try and discover what it is in God and His church that is not just some kind of way of going through life that our parents gave us, but honest to goodness, for whatever reason, however we might come to understand it, what we stand in the middle of when we come to church on a day like this and celebrate the Divine Liturgy and receive Holy Communion is something totally beyond time and space. And that if we can somehow not be distracted by all the insanity, all the inane things that are going on all around us, if we can use them as things that can, in our process, focus us on the one thing needful, then all of these things, just as we hear Joseph say, after his brothers are apologizing because they're afraid he's going to do something terrible to them. Yeah, you meant it for evil, but God means it all for good. Let us pray that we may be attentive and awake enough to begin to see the process we are on, and to recognize that where our parents and where the people who cared about us most and where about our church tries to point us is really the only place for us human beings to go. All of this to the glory of God and to our salvation.